Week 15, and it is officially your fantasy football playoff stretch. It is win or go home. We can't afford L's moving forward. We take it 1 week at a time, and we try to rack up those W's. But today I got you guys covered with my top wide receiver rankings in the tier list format I give you guys every week, going through my wide receiver 1s, my wide receiver 2s, my wide receiver 3s, and my favorite flex plays entering week 15 of fantasy football. Like I said, it is crunch time. You cannot afford to make the wrong decision, and I'm here to help you make the right ones. But we start off with the will they play tier, along with a receiver that is already ruled out. George Pickens being the receiver ruled out with that hamstring injury. Hopefully he is able to come back for week 16. But in terms of the will they play tier, we start off with Ladd McConkey of the LA Chargers. He has practiced in limited capacity all week, and he is listed questionable this upcoming weekend with those shoulder and knee injuries. But Dr. David Chow does expect him to make his return, and if he is able to suit up, he's a top 15 level wide receiver in my rankings this week. And next up with Darnell Mooney, as I'm recording this, it has been confirmed he practiced in full on Friday, and he is expected to play on Monday Night Football after missing practice on Thursday. So with that context, he would figure himself into that flex play area. But of course, with Monday night, had to tread a little bit carefully, pay attention to what happens today, but it does sound like he will be able to suit up on Monday Night Football. And the other side of the Monday Night Football matchup, we have Jacoby Myers, obviously of the Las Vegas Raiders. He practiced in limited capacity this week, and he is listed as questionable for Monday. They, of course, still have their practice on Saturday. Do monitor what happens. Does he practice in limited? Does he practice in full? If that is the case, we are expecting him to play. He is my wide receiver 34 this week. Had to downgrade him a little bit with the Desmond Ridder announcement as the starting quarterback. But now we go straight to the wide receiver 1s, and we're starting off with the clear-cut number 1 wide receiver in fantasy football right now. I'm not going to get cute with it. It's Ja'Marr Chase of the Cincinnati Bengals, over 25 implied points this week, 25.75 for Cincinnati, going on the road to play the Tennessee Titans. With Ja'Marr Chase, like I said, it's pretty self-explanatory. This guy is averaging 24.4 PPR points per game this season, and no other wide receiver in the NFL is averaging over 20. When we're talking about Ja'Marr Chase, Cincinnati, great offense implied, like I said, for a high total. Ja'Marr Chase has 6 more receiving touchdowns than any other player in the NFL right now. He's the single biggest advantage in fantasy football, and I think anybody ranking him outside of number 1 is doing you a disservice. Wide receivers 2 and 12 respectively actually did play in that slugfest of a Thursday night football game. On one hand, my number 2 wide receiver, Puka Nacua, very solid game despite the weather, despite the overall circumstances of a 12-6 football game. Puka Nacua, 8 targets, 7 receptions, 97 receiving yards, and also added 11 rushing yards in this game, finishing with 17.8 PPR points. Is it comparable to what he did against Buffalo? No, but at the same time, 17.8 you will take as a good start to the week. On the flip side, though, if you start a Cooper Kupp who comes in at 12, not a great day for you, man. 3 targets, 0 receptions, obviously 0 receiving yards, finishing with a complete goose egg on the box score. If you're relying upon Cooper Kupp in the fantasy playoffs, hopefully your other players can make up. But now we move on to wide receivers 3 and 5 respectively, also playing in the same matchup. On one hand, obviously, my beloved Nico Collins of the Houston Texans. And on the other side, we have Tyreek Hill of the Miami Dolphins. Houston are 3-point favorites at home in this game, and it does figure to be a potentially high-scoring affair. We will start off with Nico Collins. I mentioned that Ja'Marr Chase is the only wide receiver in fantasy with over 20 PPR points per game. But if you do isolate Nico Collins' season, you will see that in games he's played over 50% of the snaps, he's averaging nearly 22 PPR points per game at 21.83 on the year. Yes, is the Miami matchup difficult? Absolutely, but on the same side, Nico Collins, top 5 level wide receiver talent, tethered to an offense with 25 implied points at home, and as we know, can get there in multiple ways. Touchdown equity, big play equity, alpha in his offense, that size, the speed that Nico Collins brings to the table. He is a type of option that can completely break open a slate. And on the other side, this is the exact description we've talked about with Tyreek Hill in past years. Obviously, last year, a clear-cut top 2 wide receiver in fantasy. And while he hasn't quite been on that level this year, we have seen the upside return since Tua Tagovailoa returned to the lineup in Week 8. Since Week 8, we're seeing Tyreek Hill averaging 16.3 PPR points per game, and he scored 20 PPR points in each of his last 2. Third highest over-under of the week, like I said. And with the way Tua Tagovailoa has been playing, with the way Tyreek Hill has been playing as of late, 4 touchdowns in his last 5 games, he is a set-it-and-forget-it wide receiver 1. Wide receiver 4 for me this week is Justin Jefferson of the Minnesota Vikings, over 25 implied Vikings points at home against Chicago this week. I talked about it on last week's wide receiver tier list, but he was entering a dry spell, man. 6 straight games without scoring a touchdown, and we saw that regress to the mean this past week. 2 touchdowns against Atlanta. Sam Darnold now tied for 3rd in the NFL in touchdown passes, and with over 25 implied points at home, with arguably the best wide receiver in the NFL, he is a clear top 4 option for me. I understand he didn't have the greatest box score in his last game against Chicago, but I think Justin Jefferson gets his redemption this week. Wide receiver 6, and my beloved CeeDee Lamb is next up on this list. Just over 20 implied points for the Cowboys on the road against Carolina this week, 20.25 to be exact. And with CeeDee Lamb, since the bye week, 18.12 PPR points per game. And despite it being a run funnel Carolina defense, Carolina is actually favored in this game. And with how Bryce Young has been playing on the other end, I think we're in store for a competitive game on Sunday. With CeeDee Lamb, yes, does his ultimate ceiling ultimately get hindered because of Cooper Rush, because of the low Cowboys implied offensive total? Sure, but at the same time, with CeeDee Lamb, leads the league in targets, and as we know, he is a top 5 wide receiver talent. So with CeeDee Lamb, again, he's not quite the 27 point per game player he was down the stretch last year, but 18.12 points per game since the bye week makes him a strong wide receiver 1 option. And then number 7, a guy that I did not expect to have this aggressively ranked on my list, but I do have to give him his flowers. We're going next to Courtland Sutton of the Denver Broncos, 24 implied Broncos points at home against the Colts this week. And with Courtland Sutton, I'm even shocked myself, like I said, that I have him at number 7 here. But he's been absolutely dominant since week 8 and has a prime matchup against this Colts defense. With Courtland Sutton, over 20 PPR points per game since week 8. And he has gotten 70 plus receiving yards and or a receiving touchdown in each game since. We know obviously Bo Nix has been playing well. Courtland Sutton, the alpha wide receiver 1 for this team. There's no reason for me not to rank him aggressively. The way he's been playing, over 20 PPR points per game, like I said, prime matchup against Indy, he needs to be ranked this high. And he does rank higher than another guy that was drafted in the first round of a lot of your fantasy drafts, but I do have to downtick Amon-Ra St. Brown as of late. I'll talk about Jameson Williams a little later on in the video, but Amon-Ra St. Brown is having a down year by his own standards. 17.4 PPR points per game, don't get me wrong, that is a strong total overall. But when you do compare it to what he did last year he was at 20.7 PPR points per game. So despite the Lions offense looking like the clear-cut best offense in the league, we have seen a down year by Amon-Ra St. Brown standards. And I think that's a couple factors as to why. With the first factor, I mean, the Lions' passing volume has simply decreased from last year. This year, they're only averaging about 30.2 pass attempts per game, whereas last year we saw them at 35.9. And the other factor with Jameson Williams emerging, with how strong this run game has been, we just simply have not seen Amon-Ra St. Brown dominate the level of targets that we saw last year. Last year, we saw him be a legitimate 30.2% target share player. This year, he is down to 26.8. So although he is a strong, mid wide receiver 1 projection, I simply don't think he can be viewed as an elite option based off the overall ceiling, based off the overall volume that some of the other options get comparatively. Wide receiver 9 for me is A.J. Brown. And speaking of volume being an issue, I mean, A.J. Brown went on record to call out the passing offense of the Eagles this past week. And as we'll get to with Devontae Smith in a bit, this Eagles passing offense, we're talking about historic levels of low passing output. 25.2 pass attempts per game so far. And I get it. I mean, they have a strong defense. Obviously, Saquon Barkley playing like the best running back in the league. You want to pound the football. You want to trust your defense. I understand that. But at the same time, I do think they are relying on the run a little too much. Like I said, we'll talk about that in a little bit, just how reliant they are on the run game. But A.J. Brown, he's had such a strong season from a metric standpoint that I do think he will see positive regression in his box score sooner rather than later. He has been playing like arguably the second best receiver in the NFL. Jamar Chase, we know, has been the number 1. You can make the argument that based on this year from a metric standpoint, A.J. Brown is right there. We just have not simply seen the passing volume from the Eagles so far. And while the Steelers do represent a run funnel defense, I'm ranking Brown aggressively because you're getting elite talent. And I do think with him airing out the issues in public, we could potentially see A.J. Brown have a big time bounce back game. Wide receiver 10 for me is Mike Evans of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. 21.25 implied road Bucs points this week on the road against the LA Chargers. And I get it. It is a stout Chargers defense. It's been a great performing unit all year. But this really boils down to 2 factors for me for Mike Evans. The first is that he has as high of a weekly ceiling as any other wide receiver in fantasy, given the touchdown equity he has on this offense. And the second factor is that he has 410 yards off of 1,000. And I think the team will do everything in their power to get him over that total. Big Mike, I understand, was disappointed disappointing this last week, but I do think he bounces back, and in games he's played 60+% of the snaps. We're looking at a guy averaging over 16 PPR points per game this year. Baker tied for third in the NFL in terms of touchdown passes with Sam Darnold, and despite the matchup, 21.75 implied road points against the Chargers is very respectable, and like I said, I do think Evans does get on the scoreboard this week. And then finally, closing off my wide receiver ones, we have Drake London of the Atlanta Falcons. Kirk Cousins has been a complete mess as of late. I mean, 0 touchdowns, 8 interceptions in his last 4 games. It's very safe to say that the quarterback is struggling in this Atlanta offense. However, when we do look at this passing game, even despite Kirk Cousins' struggles, we have seen Drake London take a full alpha role, 26 targets in these last 2 games, and we're still implied for over 24 Falcons points in this one. On the road, Monday Night Football, we already mentioned Darnell Mooney could be banged up entering the game, and Drake London is one of the safest volume projections in fantasy. If Kirk Cousins starts playing well again, we could potentially see Drake London get on the board and maybe even have a top 5 level ceiling. But you guys knew to start these guys like I mentioned at the top, so now let's focus some more time on my wide receivers 13 to 36. But before I do so, if you guys want all of our rankings moving forward throughout these playoffs to make those crucial start-sit decisions, there's one of 2 ways to access our weekly rankings manifesto right now. First way, Underdog Fantasy using promo code FSC. If you guys sign up, first deposit at least $10, you make 1 play on the site, you will get access to our full rankings throughout the fantasy playoffs. And the other way is by going over to flockfantasy.com. Promo code FSC will get you 30% off any site-wide package as well as a 7-day free trial on the site. So if you guys want those rankings, number 1 resource moving forward, those are the 2 ways to access our weekly rankings manifesto. Starting off the high-end wide receiver 2s, I already talked about his teammate at number 1 on this list. At 13 for me this week is T. Higgins of the Cincinnati Bengals. Did he have an off game this past week? Sure, but at the same time, with how the Cincy offense has been playing, with how T himself has been playing, I have to be ranking him aggressively. On the season with T. Higgins, 16.64 PPR points per game. And with this Cincy offense, like I said, implied for 26 points, T. Higgins is a very strong start. 73 targets in his 8 games played. Sure, like I said, Chase is going to be inevitable, don't get me wrong. But at the same time with T. Higgins, he's been a strong wide receiver 1 in his own right. It is a tough matchup against Tennessee. With the amount of volume he's getting with how this offense has been playing, he comes in at 13 for me. Wide receivers 14 and 16 for me actually both play for the New York Jets. At 14, we have Garrett Wilson. At 16, we have Devontae Adams, obviously, for the Jets this week, going up on the road to play the Jacksonville Jaguars. The Jets offense has been extremely volatile, but these 2 have been the constants in the passing game. And in fact, both of these guys rank top 4 in targets per game this year. We know they're alphas. I do prefer Wilson by a hair, but I would not be shocked if they bounce big performances off of each other. And then sandwiched between the Jets, we have Terry McLaurin of the Washington Commanders, 25.5 implied Commanders points on the road against New Orleans this week. And with Terry McLaurin, he's been having the best season of his career. I do have a little bit of concern that if the Commanders get their run game going, 7.5 point road favorites in this game, that we could see a lack of volume in the passing game. However, with Terry McLaurin, we have seen big time touchdown equity on this offense. His 9 receiving touchdowns actually ranks second to Jamar Chase in the NFL this year. And when you isolate that down to red zone receiving touchdowns, he is actually tied with Jamar Chase with 7. As we know, 3 touchdowns in his last 2 games, 5 in his last 5. Jaden Daniels, sure, he has been volatile as of late, but we know the ceiling he represents in this passing game. And Terry McLaurin has shown he's been a strong wide receiver 2 all year. My wide receiver 17 was actually Jawan Jennings, who played on Thursday night. Obviously, the big-time divisional affair, the Rams taking on the 49ers. For Jawan Jennings, I mean, the peripherals were there. 9 targets in this game. Unfortunately, the box score did not catch up. Only 2 receptions on those 9 targets, 31 receiving yards, finishing with 5.1 PPR points. So not the greatest start if you did start Jawan Jennings. It is unfortunate, but if you told me going into the night he would have 9 targets, I would be more than comfortable ranking him at 17. And then wide receiver 18 for me is Jackson Smith and Jigba of the Seattle Seahawks, 21.75 implied Seahawks points on the road against Green Bay this week. It is a tough matchup, don't get me wrong, but it is overall a good game environment. Top 5 overall over-under with the Sharps hammering the over in this game. And quite simply, JSN is simply too good to fade lower. I mean, with JSN, since week 9, he's averaged 22 PPR points per game. And with DK being back, JSN has been the wide receiver 1 as of late. He's finally taking that leap. This is the guy I thought he would potentially develop going into the year, and he has finally arrived. So with wide receiver 18, I am factoring in the tough matchup, but at the same time, with how JSN has been playing, there's no real matchup that I can knock him even lower than this. Moving on to the low-end wide receiver 2s, we start off with my wide receiver 19 this weekend, a guy that has been off and on this list overall across the year. We have Jordan Addison of the Minnesota Vikings. Like we mentioned with Jefferson, very high implied total for the Vikings offense this week. And Jordan Addison has been on an absolute tear as of late. 4 touchdowns in his last 6 games, 19.16 PPR points per game in that stretch. And he's also had 2 separate 30 bombs now with Jordan Addison, like we see from this tweet from Dataroma. Against a cover 3 heavy Bears defense, Addison has the type of ceiling that we are craving in this matchup. Minnesota, like we said, very high implied total for the offense. And with the Bears running cover 3 at a 47.7% rate, we could see Jordan Addison get loose. Wide receiver 20 for me this week is Brian Thomas Jr. of the Jacksonville Jaguars, 18.5 implied Jaguars points at home against the New York Jets. And with Brian Thomas Jr., 22 targets in his last 2 games. And while the Jets matchup on paper does seem tough, obviously Sauce Gardner on the other side, we have seen the Jets pass defense simply not be the same unit this year. Yes, is Mac Jones a potential issue? Sure. But betting on BTJ is just as simple as trusting an extremely talented alpha target level earner with the type of big play upside to take over a matchup. And to Mac Jones' credit, he has been playing some solid football as of late. In these last 2 games, he's been able to support BTJ. And BTJ in those 2 games, 17.65 PPR points per game. So have to dock him here because there is a risk level with Mac Jones. But at the same time, if Mac Jones keeps playing the way he has the last 2 weeks, you can make the argument that BTJ is too low on this. And then next up at wide receiver 21, we have DK Metcalf of the Seattle Seahawks, 21.75 implied Seahawks points on the road against Green Bay. And like I said with JSN, he does need to be ranked higher because of how dominant he's been. But as we know, DK Metcalf, he just seems due for a big game. Obviously, we know the whole spiel, size, speed, outside ability on the boundary. But as we know, like we saw before the bye week, he has the opportunity on any given week to score 20, 25 plus PPR points and inject that into your playoff matchup this week. It is a top 5 over-under on the slate. And with this high-scoring potential game, DK Metcalf, I think, crosses over the end zone line. Wide receivers 22 and 24 respectively for me on one hand are Malik Nabers of the New York Giants, and on the other hand we have Zay Flowers of the Baltimore Ravens. The biggest spread of the week, obviously we have Malik Nabers playing for the Giants, big time underdogs in this game to Baltimore at home, only implied for 14 points, whereas on the other hand with Baltimore obviously implied for 28.5 on the road. Baltimore being 14.5 point road favorites pretty much sums up how both of these team seasons have gone. We'll start off with Malik Nabers. I mean, what he's doing as a rookie is simply unprecedented. We're seeing a rookie wide receiver that is averaging 11.5 targets per game and posting north of a 34% target share on the year. We're legitimately looking at one of the most peppered wide receivers of all time. We're talking about a comparable target season to 2021 Cooper Kupp in his Triple Crown year. In that year, Cooper Kupp, 11.2 targets per game. Malik Nabers, like I said, at 11.5 this year. Even when we look even further, we have Michael Thomas in 2019 at 11.56 targets per game. Basically the exact output per game we're seeing from Malik Nabers. I understand it. The offense is awful. It's tough to trust Tommy DeVito, but you cannot deny this level of involvement. And although he doesn't have quite the ceiling that we saw earlier in the year, even since he returned from his concussion issues, he's averaged 12.93 PPR points per game and has not scored a single touchdown in that stretch. If he does end up finding the end zone, again, I understand it is a tough thing to project given the 14 implied total for New York. But even despite the offensive circumstances, he just feels too talented to fade. And with Zay Flowers, he's dealing with his own issues. In fact, they're almost the complete opposite to what Malik Nabers is dealing with, because with Malik Nabers, we know the volume is there, but we don't trust the offensive projection. It is a complete inverse with Zay Flowers. The thing I'm worried about is that New York is a very much run funnel defense. If they get up early in this game, again, 14.5 road favorites, we could see the Derrick Henry show take away. For me personally, when I'm looking at Zay Flowers, obviously we know he has that big time high ceiling, but we have seen him get game scripted out of games. If Derrick Henry gets going early, that is the risk for Zay Flowers, and I do think the way he pays off is him contributing to the box score early in this game. But moving on to the wide receivers threes, we start off with my wide receiver 25 this week with DJ Moore of the Chicago Bears, 18.25 implied Bears points on the road against Minnesota this week. And there is a risk here. There is the risk that Minnesota completely shuts down this Bears offense. We saw it against San Francisco last week. And Minnesota has the type of pass rush that can absolutely get after Caleb Williams. We know they're going to blitz him early and often. And I am concerned that the Chicago Bears offensive line does not hold up. However, Caleb has improved down the stretch, and DJ Moore has been an absolute target monster. Yes, it's a low implied total. Yes, like I said, the Vikings defense could overwhelm Caleb Williams in this Bears offense. But DJ Moore gets too much volume to fade, and I think 25 is an appropriate spot given the risk and reward here. A wide receiver 26, we have Jalen Waddle of the Miami Dolphins, 22 implied Miami Dolphins points on the road against Houston, like I talked about in the Nico Collins, Tyreek Hill bit. But Jalen Waddle, I just got to say this. Big shout out to Jalen Waddle for how he has turned around his season in these last few weeks. We know in that mid portion of the year, what was it? 8 straight games with less than 10 PPR points. Whereas now in 2 of his last 3 games, he has gone absolutely off. And like I mentioned earlier, this is the 3rd highest over-under of the slate. Tua's playing well, offense looking good, and the final variable for Jalen Waddle is simply himself having to play better, which he has in these last few weeks. So 20.2 PPR points per game in these last 3 games, and if he does have another big game with this type of usage, I'm fully confident calling him back. Except at 27, we have Adam Thielen of the Carolina Panthers, 22.75 implied Panthers points at home against my beloved Dallas Cowboys. Advantageous matchup, great game environment for Adam Thielen. And we've seen him be an absolute target monster for Bryce Young in these last 2 weeks. Bryce Young has been playing well since returning from the benching, and Carolina has implied for nearly 23 points at home. With this type of role, we've seen Adam Thielen dominate as a fantasy option just last year, and I could potentially see him close off the season extremely strong. But moving on to my wide receiver 28, we have Calvin Ridley of the Tennessee Titans, 20.75 implied Titans points at home against Cincinnati. And we know the song and dance of Calvin Ridley this year. I mean, he's been volatile, but he does have that strong alpha role, and he has a very high weekly ceiling. I mean, we have seen since they traded DeAndre Hopkins, 15.1 PPR points per game in that stretch, 30% target share, and of course, Cincinnati represents a top 4 matchup for wide receivers this season. He has a high ceiling. You could argue him being higher, but there are just a ton of great options at wide receiver this week, which is why, given his risk levels, I rank him here at 28. At 29, we have Jameson Williams of the Detroit Lions, 28.5 implied Lions points at home against Buffalo. And with Jameson Williams, we have seen a big-time role bump as of late. And in the last month, it's been more of a 1A, 1B situation with him and Amon-Ra. We do see this tweet here from Jared Smola last 4 weeks. Target share, Amon-Ra St. Brown, 23%, Jameson Williams, 21%. And first rate target share, St. Brown, 27%. Jameson Williams just behind him at 24%. So yes, Amon-Ra St. Brown, don't get me wrong, he is the wide receiver 1 of this team, but the gap has never been closer between him and Jameson Williams. And in that stretch for Jameson Williams, he has averaged 14.25 PPR points per game. We know he has big play touchdown upside. They are implied for the total. They are at 28.5, leading the slate. And Jameson Williams, I understand that he showed as volatile early in the year, but if he has this type of a consistent floor with the involvement he's seen, I really do think he could be a riser moving forward like an Adam Thielen. But moving on to my wide receiver 30, and it is Devontae Smith of the Philadelphia Eagles, 24 implied Eagles points. And you may be asking, well, Devontae Smith is a guy we were drafting as a top 15, top 18 wide receiver this year. What happened? Well, like I mentioned with A.J. Brown, this Eagles passing offense, simply from a pure volume standpoint, they're averaging just over 25 pass attempts per game. The next closest team is at over 28 with Green Bay. They are averaging 3 attempts per game less than any other team in the NFL. And in fact, when you take their overall passing split, they only throw the ball 43.49% of the time. We haven't seen a total that low since the 2009 Jets. We have not seen a split that low in 15 years. The Eagles are playing 2000s level football, and it makes sense. I mean, their defense is strong. Obviously, Saquon Barkley having an MVP level year. And Devontae Smith has been the main one affected. Now, like I said with A.J. Brown, he did call out the passing game in the media this week. We could see some potential regression in that regard. But at the same time, Philadelphia is winning games. And while I do think A.J. Brown will regress positively, I don't know how much pie is left for Devontae Smith given how low this passing output is. Moving on to my flex plays, we have Marvin Harrison Jr. of the Arizona Cardinals coming in at wide receiver 31 for me this week. And with Marvin Harrison Jr., it's pretty simple. I mean, 26 targets last 3 games, 26 implied point offense. That is the positive for Marvin Harrison in this matchup. The downside is that Marvin Harrison himself just has not been a consistent wide receiver this year. And while he does have the spike weeks to potentially give you 20, 25 points on any given week, we have seen those come few and far between. And there is another potential variable here. Christian Gonzalez has been listed as questionable with a shoulder injury. If he does suit up, obviously we do downtick Marvin Harrison Jr. But if he is out for this game, Marv's projection does get a lot cleaner. So if you do have Marvin Harrison Jr., make sure you keep tabs on the Christian Gonzalez situation. But coming in at wide receiver 32, we have Josh Downs of the Indianapolis Colts. It does look like he will finally be back this week after practicing in full on Thursday. And he's averaged nearly 14 PPR points per game when healthy this year. It's a very difficult matchup against the stout Broncos pass defense. I do trust the volume, and I do trust Josh Downs as the Colts wide receiver 1 with the injury issues that Pittman has seen. In full PPR leagues, he's a safe bet. Again, he's got the easiest matchup on the field from the slot, and we have seen him peppered across the year. And speaking of getting peppered, we go on to Keenan Allen of the Chicago Bears here. I already talked about his teammate with DJ Moore. And while it was a down week for Keenan Allen this past week, he has been extremely involved as of late. over 23 PPR points and 15 targets in his last matchup against Minnesota. And like I mentioned with DJ Moore, if the Vikings pass rush does get going, the one safety valve for Caleb Williams to get the ball out of his hands is his slot wide receiver with Keenan Allen. And I already talked through the Lions duo, but on the flip side of the game environment, I really do like what these Bills pass catchers represent. 26 implied points, highest over-under of the week. Both have very appealing projections for me. Yes, I understand Cooper is the riskier projection because he has had low snap share totals. However, despite a 53% snap share last week, we did see him command 14 targets in this offense. And while I do prefer him slightly to Shakir, I view Cooper as the ceiling play, and I view Khalil Shakir as your safe volume projection from the slot. But coming in at wide receiver 36, we have Deebo Samuel of the San Francisco 49ers, obviously already played on Thursday Night Football against LA. There was a lot of drama going on with Deebo Samuel. He said he's not getting the touches going into the game. I was baking in maybe a potential bounce back here now that they have that incorporated in their game plan. Very big overall matchup advantage against LA. And whether it was the weather, whether it was Deebo itself, I don't know what the case was, but Deebo Samuel had a very disappointing performance. 7 targets, 3 receptions, 16 receiving yards, only contributing 3 rushing yards in this game. He only gave you 4.9 PPR points in your lineup. So if you did start Deebo Samuel, hopefully the rest of your team can make up for it because this guy's been a dud all year apparently. But either way, if you guys enjoyed, make sure you leave a like down below. Like I mentioned in the middle of the video, if you want access to all of our weekly rankings manifesto, there's one of 2 ways to get it right now. First way, Underdog Fantasy, promo code FSC. If you sign up and first deposit at least $10, make one play on the site, you guys will get access to all of those rankings throughout the playoff weeks. And the other way is by going over to flockfantasy.com. Promo code FSC will get you 30% off any site-wide package, as well as a 7-day free trial on the site. That Rankings Manifesto is the #1 resource to getting you guys your fantasy football championships. But either way, with that being said, peace out. Good luck in your matchups. Go on to that semifinal, baby.